Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Mackenzie Bean with Becker's ASC Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter. Richa Singh is the Executive Vice President of CollectRx. Ms. Singh has served in senior sales management positions for more than 10 years. She was employed in the information technology field, first with Cisco Systems and then with Vocus, one of the nation's leading companies in public relations software. Her IT experience has provided her with key skills applicable to her current role at CollectRx. Ms. Singh also served as an account executive for Merrill Lynch. Having joined CollectRx in 2010, Ms. Singh now serves as CollectRx's Executive Vice President of Sales. Her responsibilities include developing and implementing corporate-wide sales and marketing strategies, sales management reporting and systems, overseeing the sales, marketing, account management staff and functions, and serving as lead relationship manager with several of the firm's largest clients. During her tenure at CollectRx, she has been instrumental in the firm growing its client base to more than 1,300 healthcare provider organizations located throughout the country. Ms. Singh holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Maryland, supplemented by certification programs and advanced training in sales management information systems. Richa, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Mackenzie. Hi, everyone. Again, this is Richa Singh, and I'm Executive Vice President at CollectRx. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about one of the most important issues in the out-of-network arena, and that is the payer's use of third-party rental networks and the problems that they can cause providers. Now, most providers, they mistakenly think signing up with third-party networks will solve all of their out-of-network reimbursement problems, but in reality, these agreements, they have a number of issues that actually result in lower reimbursements for providers. So before I dive in today, I do want to be clear that we're not offering any legal advice here today. So if you need legal advice, we encourage you to seek your legal counsel. All right, so with that said, here's a brief summary of what we'll be talking about today. We'll first start off with CollectRx's background and out-of-network expertise in this area. Then we will define third-party network agreements and describe their purpose. Then I'll go into a deep dive of the various gotchas in these agreements. And finally, we'll wrap up by discussing a cousin to the rental network agreement, which is the so-called global discount agreement, which is also known as the continuous discount agreement. And these are similar tools that are used by payers to reduce reimbursements as well. And the objective today when you leave here is that you'll have a better understanding of what you're getting into with these agreements and be better educated about the issues with respect to these agreements. All right, so before discussing these topics, let me provide a quick summary of our experience in out-of-network reimbursements, because this will help you all understand why we're in a position to address these issues. And despite our name, CollectRx, we are not a collections agency. We have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry. But simply put, what we do here at CollectRx is we employ various proprietary strategies to help providers collect higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. And we don't really do this as consultants, but more as experts in directly negotiating higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. And CollectRx is the only company in the country that's focused solely on helping providers get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills, and we do this on a no-risk basis. We work with more than 1,300 customers nationwide, and we process more than $1 billion in out-of-network claims each year, so we've seen lots of different scenarios. We also work with a variety of provider types, so, including hospitals, surgery centers, labs, behavioral health, and physician practices. And to get the results that we get, we rely on two critical and unique capabilities. The first is what we call CRIXIS, and this stands for the CollectRx Information Systems, and it's a proprietary data and analytics tool that we've developed to support us as we go toe-to-toe with payers. And CRIXIS, it helps analyze insurance policies, it provides comparable data, and it also allows us to track the tendencies and trends of the people and practices that are on the insurance company side of this equation. Now, the second capability is our expertise, and we've built a very unique team of out-of-network experts who used to work for the insurance companies and their vendors. This puts us in a unique position to understand the soft spots in the payer's position and get higher payments on out-of-network bills for our customers. All right, so let's switch gears, and we'll talk about that cost containment tactic that's being increasingly used by payers today to reduce out-of-network reimbursements. And again, that's what we call third-party rental network agreements, or also the so-called silent PPOs you might have heard. Again, we will, towards the end, go into global discount agreements, which are very similar, and they are also referred to as continuous discount agreements. And this is a topic that we get asked about all the time. You know, seemingly every day we are asked by providers to review their contracts that they're considering entering into or contracts they're considering canceling. And one of the things we offer providers is a free analysis of the business terms of their third-party rental agreements to help them figure this out. And, you know, we hear all the time from our providers that, hey, I have a contract, it's got a fixed, 70% contracted rate, but I'm only getting allowed at 40% of charges. Why is that? So we'll talk about some of those factors today. But to start with, let's define what a third-party rental network agreement is. And third-party rental network agreements, they are contracts that are signed not with an individual payer, but with a third party that contracts with a lot of payers. Sometimes hundreds of them. So think of these third parties like middlemen of sorts. It brings together payers and providers to participate in contracts that often are not favorable from a provider's perspective for a number of reasons. And networks they put a provider in are often offered to other payers and networks that the provider doesn't even know or receive notice about. So this is why they call it, the so-called silent PPO. So some of the examples of the types of companies that work for the payers to reduce out-of-network bills are companies like Three Rivers, Multiplan, HRGI Group, Global Excel, Zealous. I mean, those are just to name a few. And collectively, we at CollectRx refer to these companies as vendors. And I'll be using that terminology throughout this presentation as well. So these vendors, they save the payers money by reducing out-of-network payments to providers. And the goal is to maximize that payment reduction. So in return, the larger the reduction, the larger the vendor's commission, because this is how the vendors make their money. And these contracts, they sound very easy. With one contract, you essentially have an agreement with all of the payers that are signed up on their network at what appears on the surface to be really reasonable rate. Now, most providers, however, just don't even either read the contracts before signing or sometimes just don't understand the seemingly innocuous terms if they do read them. And therefore, they don't know how detrimental they can be. So it's important to understand who is the customer with these agreements. And to be clear, it is not the patient. It is not the provider. It is the insurance company. So go even check out the third-party network websites and you'll see it right there. The reason this is important is that they are not there to serve you, but they're there to serve the insurance companies. And they do this as a cost containment initiative for the payers. So think about it. If they're helping insurance companies save money, then who's losing that money? So while these agreements, they might sound attractive because they are easy to implement, these relationships oftentimes have unintended consequences and should be closely scrutinized. So let's review some of the specific issues that often arise in these agreements. All right, we'll begin with the key differences between true in-network managed care contracts and third-party rental network agreements. Okay, so managed care contracts. These are the agreements that are directly between you, the provider, and the insurance company. So these contracts, they can take several months to negotiate. But on the other hand, with these third-party contracts, just as we discussed, they're the middleman contract between you and the insurance company, and these can be negotiated relatively quickly. Multiple payers, they join the third-party network through these agreements, and oftentimes providers, they don't even know what payers are in the network because the networks are not required to tell them. And by the same token, multiple providers join the network as well. So you're rarely a quote-unquote exclusive specialty provider. Also, the rates, they may appear better than managed care contracts, which lures providers in, but these rates are subject to greater cuts and restrictions. And finally, to be clear, there is typically no patient steerage from these rental agreements. So let's go into that topic a little bit more and how these contracts treat patient steerage, because in the traditional managed care contract situation, you're essentially agreeing to a volume discount in exchange for the insurance company steering patients to you. And they do this because they'll offer better rates and exclusivity or partial exclusivity in the network. But in contrast with these third-party rental network agreements, you're accepting discounted rates, but typically are not seeing any additional patients. The next key to consider are, do providers know that they've entered such agreements? So not only do providers have no idea of the breadth of these agreements, but sometimes they don't even know that they were entered into them. They could have been, what we see is that they were signed years ago by staff no longer at the facility, and the current provider doesn't even know it. I mean, there's many, many times where we are in the middle of appeal for a claim on behalf of one of our customers, and then we find that it was actually processed through a contract that the provider has no knowledge of. And I'll discuss it in a couple slides, but these contracts, they can take months and months to cancel. So the next key is, are the payers required to use a contract? And no. To begin with, payers have agreements with multiple third-party vendors and will choose the one with the lowest rate. So the vendors, they call this quilting, and they have computer programs that will run an out-of-network claim through network or repricing algorithms, and what these algorithms do is they select the one that allows the least. So again, by definition, these payers are not required to use a third-party contract just because you have it. Also, there might be types of claims that payers will not use the agreement for. So, for instance, there's something we call internally limited benefit policies. And these are plans that restrict payments to providers because the policy explicitly states that they will pay a specific amount for out-of-network patients. So it could be like a percentage of Medicare or a percentage of bill charges. And in these instances, if the reimbursement level would be lower than the provider's third-party contract, they won't apply the contract. But if the reimbursement level would be higher than the contract, then of course they will use the contract because it pays you low, or it pays lower. And insurance companies, they use this methodology of choosing the lowest payment on a case-by-case basis. All right, the next issue is, are the payers required to use the network if the logo appears on the patient's insurance ID card? Again, unfortunately, the answer is no, and a lot of providers that we speak with, automatically assume this, but you cannot rely on logos as the sole basis for third-party contract access as you can for managed care. Again, this is why you'll often hear them referred to as silent PPOs. And we often see situations where a provider participates with a network and the logo appears on the insurance ID card, but the payer decides not to use the network. And I mean, this works vice versa also. If you do not see a network logo on the ID card, a network contract still may be applied. So it's completely up to the insurance company to decide when to access a network or not, and you will not know what happens, unfortunately, until you receive and read the EOB. So next topic is, are the reimbursement levels adequate? Out-of-network reimbursements industry-wide are generally higher, and sometimes much higher, as you might know, than contracted reimbursements. So how do the reimbursement levels of your third-party contract compare to being out-of-network on a standalone basis is a question to think about. Next we have, are the reimbursement levels based on a percentage of bill charges or are they based on a percentage of allowed charges? Now, sometimes providers don't even realize that their reimbursement levels under the contracted rate are actually based on a percentage of allowed charges and not billed charges. So what this means is that the payer, they take a cut off of the billed charges to arrive at the allowed amount, and then they apply the discount, your contracted discount, to that lowered amount to determine what your reimbursement level should be. So let me explain what I'm talking about with the example on this slide. So let's say you have a case with $10,000 in billed charges, and the third-party agreement says they're reimbursing at 70% of allowed charges. The payer first will determine the allowed charges. So in this example, let's assume that the allowed charges that they determine to be are 60% of billed charges, or $6,000. Only then will the payer apply the discounted rate from the contract, which is 70% of the allowed amount. Of course, 70% of $6,000, as you can see here, is only $4,200, which would be the reimbursement level. Now, many providers, they're thinking that they're getting 70% of the billed charges, or 70% of $10,000, which is $7,000, when they're actually getting 70% of $6,000, which is $4,200. I mean, that's a $2,800 difference in their expectations. And because a lot of providers just don't carefully check the EOBs and haven't read the contract, they don't even know it's happening. So as I was talking about in the beginning, we provide these complementary analysis of third-party contracts to help providers understand the business terms and how the contract is being applied. And we did this for one of our providers who told us their contract was for 90% of billed charges. So we told them it didn't really make sense because, again, it's difficult to get a contract directly with a single payer for 90% of billed charges, let alone have a contract for any payer at 90% of charges. So when they sent us a contract, it actually read 90% of allowed charges and not billed charges. This means that the payer, they decided on what charges are allowed, then they applied the 90% rate, very similar to this example. So after we did our analysis, the provider was only averaging an allowable of 34% of billed charges with this contract and not the 90% they were expecting. And they just didn't understand this because, again, they hadn't checked their EOBs. So, another question to ask yourself is, are you carefully checking your EOBs? And if you take nothing else from today, it's that you should be checking your EOBs to make sure you're being reimbursed properly. All right, to go hand in hand with that is, are covered or eligible charges referred to in your contract? So oftentimes you'll find this language in third-party contracts, and this is what gives the payers the ability to reduce the allowed amount from the billed charges and then take the contracted discount, just like I described on the previous slide. And make no mistake, almost every third-party contract does allow payers to apply any allowable deduction mechanisms at their disposal. So it could be things like bundling or code edits or multiple procedure reductions. So when you're reviewing a contract, make sure that you're looking for language like covered, eligible, or allowed. All right, the next topic is, are you allowed to terminate at will? Typically, these contracts are for one-year terms and are subject to an evergreen clause, and that means they automatically renew on a yearly basis unless terminated by either party. Now, the catch here is the notice period to terminate. And sometimes the notice period can be as much as 180 days, meaning that you have to give a 6-month notice just to terminate. And that notice must be at least 180 days prior to the anniversary date of the contractual period. So again, follow along with me on this slide. Using dates should help hopefully explain this a little bit better. But let's suppose that you entered into an agreement back in July 1st of 2016. And then you decided this past April 2017 that you want to cancel it. But since you're less than 6 months from the anniversary date, which is July 1st of this year, you wouldn't be able to cancel it until next July 1st of 2018. So in other words, on the following anniversary date. And this is an extremely onerous termination process and can oftentimes be overlooked by providers at the time that they sign on. Okay, so this next slide is the start of one of our real-world studies from one of our clients who recently terminated their third-party rental network agreement. And what it shows is that terminating their agreement had a very positive impact on their reimbursement. And this provider had a contract for 65% with the vendor, and this vendor had multiple children organizations under it that the payers could also utilize to negotiate. So the children of the parents, they can easily access their parents' contract and price claims at 65% and just call it a day. But the children vendors, they took on the challenge from the insurance company and decided to negotiate on their own and try to beat the contract. And yes, just because you enter into a third-party network does not mean that vendors won't still try and get an even deeper discount from you on individual claims. So for this provider, before using us and before canceling their contract, they were negotiating 60% of their bill charges. That's 5 percentage points lower than the contracted rate. So this means the children vendors, they were successful in what they were supposed to do, and they beat their parents' contract of 65%, and in return, they saved even more money for the insurance companies. So then CollectorX, we stepped in, and again, this was before the contract was canceled. We were able to raise the provider's rate, but only to 65.8%, because unfortunately, we were still capped by the contract. Now, after we performed the analysis of the agreement, the provider decided to terminate it. So the termination was official on June 1st, and this had an enormous impact on the provider's reimbursement. So first off, the volume of settlement offers, it jumped up by 45%. So it went from 128 cases in May to 186 cases in June. Even better, we were able to increase their reimbursements from 65.8% in May all the way up to 88.8% in June because they were no longer capped by a contract. That's a 35% growth in this part of their revenue alone. All right, so next key to consider is, does your third-party network sublease to other payers? Now, most networks, they do sublease to other payers. It's just another way of how they make money. So these smaller third-party administrators, worker comp carriers, they can shop around to these networks to pay essentially a single usage fee, and the only requirement is that they notate the usage of the network on their explanation of benefits. So again, we see EOBs all the time where a customer is saying that they don't have a contract with that network, but what's happening is that the network on the EOB is utilizing a contract the provider does have by virtue of a network roll-up. So this is, again, another reason why you need to check your EOBs carefully. Next up, we have, are payers applying in-network discounts but with out-of-network benefits? The answer is yes. Most providers, however, they just assume that in-network benefit levels are being applied since they accepted the discount just like they've done with managed care contracts. And the payer gets the best of both worlds here. They get a discount on the rate and they get a higher out-of-network benefits. Do these agreements impact your charge master? Again, the answer is yes. Many of these agreements contain restrictions on your ability to annually increase some or all items in your charge master, which could impact all of your charges for all payers. And they explicitly state that you cannot increase your charges overall by 3% or 5%, for example. Is there a reference to an administrative handbook? Oftentimes, these agreements explicitly incorporate the terms of the third-party payer's administrative handbook into the contract. And the handbook is said to supplement the terms of the contract. Over the past several years, we have seen that handbooks are being referenced more and more in these contracts. So, for example, cuts like multiple procedure reductions, code edits, they might not even be addressed in the main contract, but it is addressed in the handbook and you don't even know it. The terms can also change at any time. How many of you out there are reading the administrative handbook cited in the contract? How many of you review it when changes are made? And we have seen that reimbursement rates have changed using this handbook. We had a provider that had a third-party contract with a vendor allowing for 70% of billed charges. all of a sudden they realized their overall collections had drastically dropped, and they just could not figure it out what it was from, because they analyzed their volume and it had not reduced. They had not renegotiated any contracts, but it took them months to do this research. But it turned out that it was the handbook that dropped their rates for a common procedure of theirs to only 120% of Medicare. So unfortunately, nobody notified them of this change, because the contracts, they often do not require that the network make the provider aware of such changes. And if your handbook cannot be accessed online, try contacting the vendor for a copy of it, but you may find that it can be pretty difficult to get a hold of. All right, the cap. So one way to think about how all of this works is that the contracted rate really just serves as a cap on their out-of-network reimbursements. So think about it. If the payer will reimburse the provider less by using the contract, then they'll use it. But if the payer will have to reimburse more by using the contract, then they won't use it. So let's think back to the case study with our provider who had the 65% contract. So if an out-of-network claim on the left-hand side would process at 80% without the contract, then yes, they're going to apply that contract at the 65% rate because it's going to allow lower. If, however, the claim on the right-hand side would process at 60% without the contract, then nope, they're not going to access that contract, and they'll process it at the lower 60%. Now, under no circumstances will it ever be processed above the contractor rate. Oftentimes, though, it can process below. This is why it's kind of a cap on your reimbursement levels. And again, remember in the case study, the provider, before canceling the contract, they were unable to negotiate higher than 60%. CollectorX was unable to go higher than the 65% contractor rate as well. So all of this benefits the payer and not you. So the bottom line here is, if you're in one of these agreements, you should seriously consider whether to keep the agreement. So ask yourself a couple questions. Does the contract bring you patients you wouldn't have seen otherwise? Does it pay your claims based on in-network benefits? Does it generate allowables that match the discount rate cited in the contract? And if you're saying no to any of these questions, you'll want to seriously consider canceling or not entering into one of these agreements. As you can see, in a lot of instances, these agreements, they hurt, not help your reimbursement. So don't just rely on anecdotal evidence that you hear from staff. It really boils down to substantial dollars at stake. Okay, so now let me talk about a cousin of the third-party rental network agreement, which again is the global discount or continuous discount agreement. And this is just another cost containment tactic used by the vendors for the insurance companies to lock you into reimbursement levels that are sometimes quite low. And so how do these agreements come about? Well, they are part of the arsenal payers deployed to reduce out-of-network payments to providers. And on a bill-by-bill basis, vendors, they'll attempt to minimize reimbursements by negotiating what are called single-case rate agreements to settle out-of-network cases one at a time. Now, usually these agreements, they start with the vendor when the vendor faxes a settlement proposal to lower the bill by a reduced amount in exchange for the provider agreeing not to bill the patient for that reduced amount. So the way that it works is, when signing a single case rate agreement on a negotiation, there's a checkbox. Well, there'll be two checkboxes, and one of them, though, will state language, something to the effect of, by checking here, I agree to accept this level of reimbursement on claims in the future. And many providers, they don't even realize that they've entered into these agreements, because oftentimes they were checked off by a staff member or maybe even a temp years ago, and those personnel may no longer be at the facility. And of course, because EOBs are difficult to read, many providers don't even realize these EOBs are even referencing these agreements. And these agreements, they suffer from many of the same issues as third-party rental network agreements. Their reimbursement rates aren't good, as you're certainly not getting any steerage of patients from continuous discount agreements. Basically, they're really heaven for the vendors. So rather than have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis, they just run it through their systems at these low rates with no risk involved. and they still get their fee for the discount with little or no effort or cost. But the good news is that they're relatively easy to cancel with a modest notice period. I mean, at a minimum, we would encourage every provider to look at these agreements closely and make a determination as to whether to cancel them or not. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for your time, and I hope you found this session useful. Before I do take questions, again, I want to mention that we do provide the free review of these contracts. So if you do need help determining whether to enter such a contract or considering canceling one of them, just let us know. And back to you, Mackenzie.
Great. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Richa. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in a space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. So it looks like a lot of great questions are coming in, and the first one is, why don't out-of-network insurance companies always use my multi-plan contract?
Okay, so again, the insurance companies, they're generally not required to access the contract. I mean, there's a number of reasons. The insurance companies, so they enter into a lot of different contracts, third-party contracts. And what they'll do is when they price a claim, they determine, okay, which of those contracts are going to pay them the least, and then they're going to choose that one. Also, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there are certain types of claims, like limited benefit policies, where the reimbursements are typically less than the contract, so they won't access it. Oh, and then also from the case study, they'll give a case to a negotiation vendor in hopes that the vendor can negotiate a deal below the contractor rate. So like I talked about, you know, the parent and children vendors in our case study, the children vendor actually beat out the parent's contracted rate, and so they weren't obligated to use it. So unfortunately, there's just really no good way to know how or when they'll access the contract.
Thank you, Reach. I think that's helpful for our audience to know. Another audience member wants to know, is there a way to increase payments and reduce access to silent PPOs?
Unfortunately, there's not really much you can do to control it. I mean, the only thing I can really think of is canceling third-party rental network agreements. That's where you'd be able to control that access.
Great. Well, thank you again. Another audience member writes, I thought I heard that Multiplan owns Viant. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, that is true. So Multiplan, they own Viant, they own NCN, Beach Street, PHCS, they own others as well. So this is what makes it very easy for any of these entities to access each other's contracts.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. The next question is, are all third-party networks something to be concerned about? Are any of them good?
Well, a lot of them have problems that we talked about. So, you know, things like no steerage, no patient steerage, the double dipping that I was talking about with contracted rates, but out-of-network benefit levels, and then, of course, termination problems. But, I mean, again, if anybody needs help looking at them or help analyzing them, we can, again, do an analysis at any time.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, Richa. It looks like we have time for one more question. And this audience member writes, I received a call from an organization that claims to deliver a network where out-of-network insurance will reimburse me at 70%. Is this a third-party contract?
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a third-party contract. Again, if you wanted to take a look at it, we'd be happy to.
Great. Well, thank you again, Richa. That is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Richa for her excellent presentation and to our audience for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.